So I recently saw some clips of Emma Vigeland going on the Vanguard, and they talked about a few different subjects, but one of the things they covered was Emma Vigeland's experience working at the Young Turks, TYT. She now works at the Majority Report with Sam Cedar. She used to be kind of like an on-the-ground correspondent at TYT, and then I believe she said that she was going to be given an actual show, or she was given an actual show at TYT, and shortly after that, she decided to move to the Majority Report. And she gets into that. It was a matter of whether she wanted to live in New York or LA. I think she was already living in New York, and she was faced with the choice of either moving out to LA to be near TYT or staying in New York. And so that's one of the main reasons that she decided to switch to the Majority Report. And I'll get back to that a little bit later, maybe. But they also covered a little bit of the labor troubles that popped up at TYT, where the staff essentially tried to unionize. And Emma was there at that time, and so she talked a little bit about that. She didn't have a ton of insider knowledge about it, and maybe the actual unionization effort didn't happen while she was there, but she mentioned that there was a little bit of that talk in that sense while she was there, and definitely that there were efforts to squash that labor movement. So the Vanguard has covered that extensively, this effort by TYT to prevent their staff from unionizing. And there's a lot of arguments made against Cenk Uygur, against Anna Kasparian, about the sort of right-wing pivot they're making, whether they're being honest, whether they're trying to turn this into a sort of right-wing grift because they see it as more profitable. And there's many angles to be had on that, but I do think probably the most important point, or one of the most important points, if not the most important point about TYT and their sort of current left-wing credibility, is the fact that when a union tried to organize itself at the workplace, Cenk Uygur's instinct was to shut it down, and he attempted to shut it down for as long as he could, and I believe they ended up unionizing, but TYT also faced repercussions from the NLRB over their union busting activity. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing that happens to Amazon. That's the kind of thing that happens to Starbucks, you know, at least at a moment or in a presidential administration where we have a functioning NLRB, which luckily we did under Biden, or a somewhat functioning NLRB, you get those type of disciplinary actions. That's what it's for. And so the fact that the NLRB had to issue disciplinary action against Cenk Uygur's union busting, it's not just that he was union busting to the extent that the staff was angry about it and speaking out about it, but they actually got disciplined by the NLRB. So that's a big deal. And even though the unionization ended up happening, it does hurt the credibility of the network, because while it's not impossible to have some kind of ostensible left-wing slant and not necessarily be pro-labor, that's not really the space that TYT fills. And I would say that that's more of like a center, barely center-left. You know, if you're against labor, then you're not really on the left wing, because labor is one of the only real sources of power that the left has, especially in this moment where institutionally the left is pretty much being fully disempowered, or anything that's not right-wing Donald Trump loyalty is pretty much being disempowered in the government right now. So, I mean, I think it's pretty much a necessity to be pro-labor. And I think TYT has covered labor unions positively to an extent. I'm not sure to what extent. There may have been critiques there in the past, but the point is that they're not forwardly an anti-union program, except when a union tries to form itself at the workplace, Cenk tries to shut it down. So it's just pretty straightforward hypocrisy. And it goes to a point that I've made before in talking about TYT, and also in comparison to the Majority Report, which is that it shows a flaw in Cenk's strategy in building this left-wing outlet. And I think that he, in many ways, tried to mimic the success of something like Fox News or any other news outlet that might have gained actual traction and became mainstream. Obviously, the idea of being like a left-wing Fox News is pretty out of the question unless you have an enormous amount of investment. And that's why something like that doesn't exist, because no billionaires are interested in investing in a left-wing outlet that is going to advocate for policies that make them less money. And so this is the fundamental problem that Cenk is finding himself troubled by more and more. And I think there were many years where TYT was kind of coasting. They had enough going on that they could sort of keep the money flowing. But one of the things that Emma Vigeland said in talking about it was that it became clear to her at a certain point that they were kind of overextending themselves. And that also goes back to what I've said about them before, is that in the ambition of Cenk Uygur to try to make this the biggest supposedly left-wing outlet that he could, he ended up creating incentives that actually go against what a person motivated by left-wing politics would do. And the union busting is the perfect example of that. The reason a guy like Cenk Uygur goes about union busting at his business is because the margin of profit that he has created is delicate. And so when you have that margin of profit and you're kind of doing whatever you can to make sure that there's enough transactions happening, whether it's ad sales or memberships, or now this new move that he's made where he sells off the ownership of his studio to Polymarket and is also sponsored on the show by Polymarket, which is a gambling app or gambling website. And so when all of a sudden your staff wants to unionize, the staff who makes this margin of profit, as marginal as it may be, a reality, they want to unionize. What that means for Cenk is that his business model is now fucked up. He can't profit maybe at all. And it forces him to reorganize and to reconsider where the money goes. So the business might still be viable, but he's not going to take home a profit. And it's entirely possible that unionizing and forcing the money to be distributed differently within the company would actually have made the company less viable, or at least that was Cenk's feeling at the time. And so the left-wing conclusion to come to, the pro-labor conclusion to come to, is that if you have a business and your staff wants to unionize and you can't continue to keep your business viable with a unionized staff, then that business shouldn't exist, at least not in the way that it does. That is the pro-labor perspective. And so there is pretty clear conflict of interest when it comes to Cenk, where he wants to be a left-wing outlet, he wants to be a progressive outlet and push for those type of policies. But then when those type of policies, which is essentially democratization of the workplace, find themselves cropping up in his own business, he's going to do what other business owners do and try to squash that organizing. And the way that differs from what Sam Seder has done is that Sam Seder has not focused on building the biggest and most flashy and mainstream looking and feeling type of platform. And he's focused on other things instead. They focused on the consistency of the content and paying their employees well. Emma has said she makes more money at the Majority Report than she did at TYT. And she said it was the best move that she ever made. And that's impressive to me. For a lot of people who are already a little bit more favorable to Sam Seder than Cenk Uygur, it's not that surprising. I mean, he seems like a better boss, frankly. But it is interesting that a outlet that appears to be bigger and have more money flowing through it, and in some ways more legitimate than Sam Seder's operation, would actually not be able to pay its hosts as much as Sam Seder is able to pay them. And we don't know if that's fully true because Sam Seder hired Emma Vigeland to be the co-host. So it's possible that she's just making more money as the main co-host than she would have made as the not main co-host at TYT. But we know that even Anna Kasparian has complained about the amount of money that she makes at TYT. She doesn't feel like it's enough. So it seems to me that Cenk Uygur, in all of his sort of endeavors to expand his capital has failed to create a workplace that makes his employees happy. And so that not only has led a lot of them to leave, but it has also led to this odd kind of kicking and screaming behavior that we've seen from Anna, where she just seems to be taking out her frustrations all over the place, whether it's, lashing out at trans people or lashing out at California Democrats, which is fair. It's fair to lash out at Democrats. I always say that. But to do it in a way that favors Republicans, which is exactly what they did when Rick Caruso was running against Karen Bass, they literally promoted the Republican candidate for mayor. And I think that this really gets to the core of why people are so skeptical of TYT and why there's such a migration away from them. And I'm not somebody who's like looking at their numbers to see how they've fallen, because to me, it's not so much about that. What I notice is that there is a lot of interest in content talking about TYT and this right-wing pivot, whether it's the Vanguard making videos about it, or there's a couple other people who have, myself included. People are interested in those videos, and I don't think it's just the drama aspect of it, although drama does do well on YouTube, and that is something that you can capitalize on as a content creator. I also think that what they've done is they've created an audience that used to be part of their own audience that is now interested in content that's talking about, that speaks to what they have already noticed about the outlet, that this is becoming a more reactionary outlet. And so people leave the network, and all of a sudden there is a demand created for content that is talking about this reactionary pivot that they're making. So by doing that, maybe they're opening themselves up to a new right-wing audience that doesn't seem like they are doing better because of this right-wing pivot. It seems like they're doing worse, maybe about the same, if anything, but probably worse. And I think it's because a lot of people have become alienated from them, and they're seeking other sources of information. And this is just an interesting pattern to see from a business that has put so much effort and money into creating this platform that feels legitimate, and it feels well-informed, and it's supposed to be the center of progressive media, the hub of progressive media. That's clearly what Cenk wants to be, and you can see that when he goes and does an interview with his nephew Hassan, and he says, "I am the left," and he's trying to assert the fact that he is the center of the entire left wing, and because of that, he can do this kind of right-wing pivot and shouldn't be scrutinized for that. And people shouldn't call out the fact that he is saying the same things that Republicans and reactionaries say, because he is the left and he's built this network. And so therefore, people shouldn't question his progressive motivations. And then you see this behavior like the union busting and that sort of thing, and even things that Emma said, where she said she was debating if she should leave the relationship that she had because that person didn't want to move to LA, and should she break up with that person so that she could move to LA and work for TYT, or should she pursue this relationship that she likes? And Cenk's answer to that was, yes, you should. You should leave that relationship and move to LA. And I mean, that's a crazy thing to hear from your boss, but it shows that essentially what he's saying is you should put the interests of the network, and you should put the supposed opportunity that comes from this network above your personal life. And it's possible that that type of leadership is exactly what has not only chased a lot of people away, but made someone like Ana Kasparian rather unhappy working for him. And that's not to speak of Ana Kasparian's own right-wing pivot, which is a different subject that I've covered a lot. But this is more about Cenk, because I see him as a figure, he's a figure of leadership on the left, whether you want to follow him at this point or not. And I think many people are deciding that they don't. And so the contrast that we see between Sam Seder and Cenk Uygur in terms of leadership is that Sam Seder prioritizes the interests and aesthetics of capital less than he prioritizes the well-being and comfort and freedom of his employees. And he said that before, that he prefers not to bother people if what they're doing is working. You know, like if somebody works for him making thumbnails or one of his co-hosts or whatever, it's like he's not gonna try to police what they say and how they say it, because what he's interested in is a self-sustaining left-wing outlet that is consistent, that consistently pushes left-wing ideals and also consistently keeps track of the right and the moves that they're doing. And in that way, even though the Majority Report does do the news, the way they proliferate content is usually focused more on certain figures, whether it's Dave Rubin or Ben Shapiro, or now, you know, this cast of clowns that Donald Trump is bringing into the White House. And so in a way, there's kind of an anti-fascist element to the Majority Report, as opposed to what TYT is doing, because this method of sort of following everything that figures on the right do and say and calling it out, calling out the contradictions, calling out the obvious anti-worker and right-wing intentions of people who are even trying to pretend that they're not right-wing, like Dave Rubin. By doing that, you're blowing their cover. And so while it may seem counterintuitive that a productive thing to do is essentially follow fascists around and continue to report on what they're doing, what it actually does is it prevents them from organizing, or at least prevents them from organizing under the pretense of anything other than right-wing fascism. And Sam Seder's outlet has been pretty successful at doing that, and I think it just contrasts interestingly from this sort of newscaster aesthetic that TYT has built up, you know, with the expensive chyrons, and it all looks very professional and legitimate. They're going for that sort of like news show legitimacy. And, you know, meanwhile, not only are they busting unions and they have hosts leaving and hosts expressing their discontent, but they also just don't seem to be doing that well. They seem to be thrashing a little bit. And it probably won't be long, if things continue to go how they're going, before Cenk has to downsize a little bit and humble his operation. And I think that Sam has instead created an operation that is focused on sustainability, and it's focused on a model that is a little bit more friendly to its employees, its labor, and just left-wing ideals in general. And I think that's just really important for us to note, especially going into these next 4 years, because, and I've mentioned this in the past couple podcasts, and I'm going to continue to talk about it, I think that pretty much the only way that we are going to see any positive change in this country, especially in the near future, but even because of the consequences of the near future, of the Trump administration, it could be a long time before any type of progressive left-wing or pro-labor ideas are embedded in the institutions in the way that we used to sort of feel that we could depend on, at least to an extent. And I think that a general strike is the only way that we're going to be able to take power back from these fascists that have come into power. The institutions are not going to save us. Congress is not going to save us. The courts are not going to save us. The Supreme Court is probably fully right-wing for the foreseeable future. And some of the older judges are probably going to retire during Trump's administration so that he can replace them with somebody younger. And that's just what we're looking at. And so because of this Trump administration, based on the institutions we have, we're probably not going to see any positive movement in the federal government for the next 50 years. It's possible that Congress could put itself in a position to, you know, pass some progressive legislation, like if there's some kind of blue sweep in Congress in 2026. But frankly, based on the voter suppression that took place in 2024, which we're starting to have some information about, it just doesn't seem like anybody progressive is going to be able to get a foothold in government for a very long time, unless there is some kind of mass strike, mass labor event that forces the powers that be to capitulate. There's no way they're going to do it otherwise. The only way that we are going to be able to assert any power over the regime as it is now is with labor. And so as we enter into that reality, we've got to think about the fact that these left-wing leaders that we have, like Cenk Uygur, is, when it counts, not as pro-labor as he might seem in his coverage, or as he might want to project in his coverage. And that's going to really matter, because if Cenk is the left and he is the centerpiece of left-wing media, I'm not saying that he is, but I'm saying if he views himself that way, and then a general strike, whether it's the general strike that Sean Fain wants to do in 2028, or an idea for a general strike that I have floated to happen sooner, aimed at the resignation of Donald Trump and essentially the repair of our election system. Once that ends up on the table, or ends up happening, and you know, the movements start to be made for a real mass general strike to happen, what side is Cenk going to take in that situation? Because it's not just about what he believes, whether he believes a mass strike is the right thing to do, or that labor has the right to a general strike if they so choose. But it's more about the fact that he has associated himself more closely with capital than other left-wing voices have. And so when that general strike starts to be on the table, that means Cenk's employees might strike, or probably would. That's what a general strike would at least ask of them, depending on how those communications go. And so Cenk has put himself in a position to be against labor when it counts. And that doesn't mean that if a general strike were to happen, Cenk would oppose it, but it does mean that he has positioned himself against the interests of labor, and so he probably would oppose it. Whereas Sam Seder, not only do his employees not seem to have the need to unionize because there's not very many of them, and his operation is a little bit more humble, it's a comparable audience. TYT has a bigger audience, but their audience is not as engaged nowadays as they were, and the Majority Report seems to be doing really well. They put out a ton of content every day, and there's a lot of engagement with most of it. And so, you know, I see the Sam Seders of the world, or even maybe this guy Tom Hartman, who broke the story from Greg Palast and did an interview with him about the voter suppression in 2024. These are the type of voices that we need to look to, who have a more genuinely independent model. Independent means you are not sucking off of the teat of capital in the way that a lot of right-wing outlets, right-wing so-called independent outlets, anything from Joe Rogan to Ben Shapiro's Daily Wire, I mean, these outlets are closely associated with capital. And so that means in the case of a general strike, or if there were talk of a general strike, 100% they would be positioned against it, because they have to be. Their money depends on it. Their stability depends on it. And so I think it's important to identify that now, because whether it happens in 2028 or sooner, if a general strike were to start to gain momentum, we can't be giving too much attention to people within the left, supposedly, that are going to be trying to break up that effort to take power back by force of labor. And, you know, I think it's pretty clear that we can see the signs in Cenk Uygur and the Young Turks that by the time that were to happen, they almost certainly would position themselves against it. And to me personally, nothing quite hurts their credibility in my mind as much as that.